Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. For this week's video, I wanted to do another layout design because I have noticed that it's been some time since I presented one. Now, I can only do the designs that I have available, and just recently there seems to be a lot of my layout design customers that have not followed through to completion on the design. And that's perfectly satisfactory. I deliberately give them a get out clause that they can terminate the contract at any time. I don't want them to be locked in case they feel that after the completion of phase one they have enough information to be able to complete the design by themselves. And indeed that's what happens in a number of cases. This design is one that I worked on a couple of years ago, and I was actually kind of disappointed that this one didn't go through to completion. The customer unexpectedly got a job transfer and had to move, just as the design was getting interesting. But I decided to resurrect it for the purpose of this video because I think it demonstrates very well how to go about designing a railroad where we have parts of multiple rooms available for the design. The main room here is round about 16 by 19, and there is a panhandle shaped area available in a second room, and also to the south there is a large family room, and the client told me he had negotiated with his family to be able to use some of this space if necessary. And of course the emphasis is in some, not all. The client worked in HO scale. He liked mainline operations. He particularly liked heavy industrial and classification switching and the interaction between local and through freights. Ideally, he wanted more than one yard and a good variety of industrial switching areas, including a rendition of a very cramped industrial town with the railroad crossing over a river that was running through the middle of town, crammed between the buildings. As you can no doubt surmise from the number of dimensions listed here, I had trouble in getting this area drawn out right. It took me a couple of attempts before I was able to start working on benchwork footprints. Here's a second attempt, still not quite right, although fortuitously we realized that this area was a lot wider than I initially thought. Eventually I got all the dimensions worked out accurately and I was able to come up with a footprint. I tried several other designs, but this was the only one that really worked in his space. Now, the client initially said that he preferred a double track main line, although later, talking about that, we both decided that a main line that was partially double and partially single would actually fit better in the room and also give him more variety of bridges and better interaction between the local and through freights. This version is shown with it entirely double track, and the intention is that the 2 points A will be connected on a lower level through staging. This was still a very early drawing in the design process. Many of the other drawings have been lost. This is one of the few that I saved. By contrast, this is one of the last drawings that I did for this design. And here we can see that while the central portion of the main line is double for quite a considerable distance, there is single track sections at both ends. And this particular schematic was copied from a railroad that I used to operate on many years ago, which had been modified from a modular railroad. The center of the guy's basement contained a double track continuous main line that had been severed at one end and then extended in both directions with single track extensions for a long point-to-point system that had about half of the overall length of the railroad in the center being a double track main, effectively multiple end-to-end passing sidings. And I remembered having a lot of fun operating sessions on that railroad with the partial double track working very well and being interesting to operate and also to dispatch. Another major advantage with going to a partially single track main is in the variety of bridges possible. There's a lot more variety of bridges suitable for single track than just double track, particularly towering trestles. And there was a good space for one of those in the main room just behind the door. If the main line had remained double track all the way, we would not have had that option. There are a few things I would like to point out on this plan, even though it is incomplete. You'll notice that in many places I haven't joined up tracks with proper switches. I think the industrial town I did first. I wanted to make sure that the curved turnouts in this rather tight area would work properly and there was enough room to get a viable track plan. Note how I elected to put the main yard across the slightly shorter end of the room than along one longer side. And there's a very good reason for that. Notice how it is necessary to have a minimum radius curve in this corner. If the main yard had been next to it, I would not be able to extend it around the corner. But by putting it across the end of the room, both ends are opened up with much bigger curves, and I can extend the yard around slightly at both ends to get more length. And actually overall that gives a better length of yard than if I was forced to remain on the straight at one end. Another reason for putting the main yard across the end of the room instead of along the side was that the width of the room did not allow the benchwork to be as wide as I would like along this south wall and still have room for an acceptable turn-back radius on the peninsula without compromising aisle widths. This plan uses probably my most common combination of standards of 30-inch minimum mainline radius and 3-foot aisles. Note also that the main yard is not designed as a division point. It is simply a local yard where through freights can stop briefly and exchange blocks of cars to be switched into either local industries or into one of several local turns that will operate out of this yard. And that saves a lot of space, not only in the volume of yard tracks required, but also in the size of the engine terminal, because that only has to serve local engines, typically a small fleet of 280s and switchers. Now, one of the photographs that the client sent me showed a dense switching area with industries on 2 levels. The main line ran on a steel viaduct over low-level industrial trackage, and I was able to duplicate that scene in this area. There are a fair number of local industries with the main line passing above. Something else that I wanted to point out on this design, which is probably useful to note if any of my viewers ever have to design a railroad that uses part of multiple rooms. Note this single track running through the trestle scene and into the steel mill scene in the other room. There is quite a long way to walk between the two areas, but by putting in what amounts to a single lap helix, I call it more of a time-wasting loop actually, the train is hidden for long enough to be able to watch it disappear into a tunnel at one end, walk around, and be ready for it when it comes out the other end. This single loop using up the dead space under the stairs goes a long way towards making sure that there is time to get around ahead of the train. In this situation it did double duty because I also needed the steel mill to be a slightly lower level so that it can disappear into a helix under this end of the main yard. Now the balance of the space is used with a short branch line to a harbour terminal, and that was something that originally not on the client's want list. As soon as he realised that the opportunity was there, he jumped at it because it meant one more tight switching area, and he really liked that idea. Now I don't remember how early in the process we talked about steel mills, but I remember by the time I drew this we were talking about putting part of a steel mill in this area. Not trying to represent the entire mill because prototype steel mills are absolutely enormous, but just enough to give a feeling of this major industry and a minimal yard to serve it. Actually this yard has to serve both for the steel mill and as an interchange for the harbour branch. Now I mentioned earlier that the main line was going to be completed via a low-level staging yard. Here's what I drew for the lower level. Helixes in the 2 wide spots and connecting the continuous run with a big staging yard. As is normal on my layout designs, if at all possible, I like to put a pair of reversing loops. Here's one and here's the other one either end of the staging yard, allowing for easy turning of trains in both directions. And I like to squeeze in additional auxiliary staging if possible. Now I think this was the only staging yard drawing I ever did for this design. At the moment it doesn't have any parking for spare locomotives, and if I had had the opportunity to finish this design I would have fixed that, probably by moving the auxiliary staging further around and putting a few locomotive spurs in this area. Here's another trick that I used on this design to maximize the staging capacity. Note how the benchwork along the north wall is significantly narrower than it is around the end of the room. Here we have a great opportunity for different length staging tracks. I use the full length available for the staging yard to fit in several really long tracks, which would be great for through freights. And then around the end of the room where the benchwork is wider, there is room for a lot more shorter tracks, good for local freights and also passenger trains. Another thing that I frequently do on railroads with a low-level staging area is to finish part of it as a separate visible diorama. In this case I elected to use the area at the bottom of the stairs. This was a great opportunity for a deep river valley, and it also meant that as visitors come down the stairs they are greeted with two very different scenes stacked one above the other. And I think that would have given his visitors a very good first impression of the railroad. Now, on this lower level I deliberately wanted to leave this area open because the client planned to build an entertainment system in this area with a widescreen TV. So by making sure that this area of the railroad only has an upper deck and no lower deck, there's plenty of room to build the TV into a cabinet underneath the railroad. Although it would probably be a good idea to ensure that the wires are long enough to be able to move the TV out of the way easily for under the railroad maintenance. Anyway, as I said earlier, just as this design was getting interesting, the client was forced to terminate the design because he was moving house, and I think we were both just as disappointed as each other, because what started out as a very unpromising space turned out to be very interesting indeed, and perfectly adequate to give him all the railroad that he wanted. So that is all I have to say about this railroad design. Let me just go back to the main level and I'll leave that up. I hope you enjoyed this presentation and found something of interest or of use to your own railroad design endeavours. And I will say goodbye until next week. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.